There's a reason why I'm going through all this detail, and that is to show how careful God was in preserving His Word, yet allowing for man to contaminate it for whatever motivations they have. Here's the Masoretic Period, which our Bibles reflect their marvelous works. The Masoretes, the third period of the textual history of the Old Testament, is usually reckoned as extending from the 6th to the 11th Christian century, when Jewish learning was transferred from the East to North Africa and Spain. So we have our Alexandrian manuscripts, as opposed to one from the Middle East, from Israel, because the Romans persecuted and tried to destroy the Bibles in that area, but not in North Africa and Spain. It embraces the age of the Masoretes proper and has for the Bible text in general the same importance as the Talmudic period had for the law. The efforts of the scholars to fix the reading and understanding of the sacred text were overshadowed somewhat by the study of the Talmud. After the close of the Talmud, the work was resumed and cultivated in Babylonia and Palestine at Tiberias. In both schools, the work of former generations was continued, but the Palestinians, who acted more independently than the more Talmudically inclined Babylonians, correct that typo there he made, finally got the victory over the Babylonian school. In both schools, they were no longer satisfied with a mere oral transmission of rules and regulations, but committed them to writing. See, they're really getting into the nitpicking of it, but this took a long time. Israel took a long time in showing how unfaithful it could be, and now it's taken a long time to bring back their Old Testament scriptures. There is no continuous history of the men of the Masorah and of the progress of the work preserved, but the marginal notes in ancient Bible manuscripts and the fragments of other works show that the oldest Masoretes can be traced back to the 8th century. The main effort of this period, as the name Masoretic tradition indicates, was to collect and to write down the exegetical critical material of the former period, and this makes sufficiently clear the one part of their work. But the Masoretes also added some new matter, anxiously following the footsteps of the older critics in their effort to fix and to guard the traditional text. They laid down more minute rules of linguistic and grammatical character, and in this respect the greater part of the contents of the Masorah is indeed new. Put my new other glasses on. Yes, better. Their work. They took the consonantal textus receptus, just as it stood, and finally settled it in the minutest details, as is seen from the variants which became a matter of controversy between the East and the West, the Babylonians and the Palestinians, which to the number of 216 Jacob ben Hayim published for the first time in the second edition of the Bomberg Rabbinic Bible. These have reference mostly to the vowel points. Go into great detail. We have confidence that it wasn't just slapped about. This list of variants, as is now known, is by no means complete. They also appended critical text notes to the text, in part derived from the Talmudic period, in part new, especially the grammatical conjectures, showing that where, according to the grammar and the genius of the language, one should expect another reading, nevertheless the text must stand. See, they just did not want to draw absolute conclusions and leave it to the next generation after that and after that and after that. Finally, the great majority of the alternative readings date from the Masoretes. The Masoretes fixed the reading of the text by the introduction of the vowel signs, the accents, and the signs which affect the reading of the consonants. The dagesh, mapik, rafi, and the diacritical point to distinguish between the letters sin and shin. They're really nitpicking on details. How many other Bibles are like that? And other religions. The pronunciation they thus brought about was no invention, but embodied the current tradition. Nevertheless, one cannot accept every Masoretic reading as infallible and unchangeable, especially when one considers that the tradition, no doubt, often fluctuated, and that with such fluctuations the less correct reading may often have come into the text. Besides the system found in the majority of manuscripts, there exists another which has only recently become known, called the superlinear system, because the vowel signs are placed above the letters. This is found in some Babylonian and South Arabian manuscripts. The same is also the case with the accents. The division of the text into verses introduced by the Masoretes was neither Babylonian nor Palestinian, but one which the Masoretes themselves seem to have established. At the beginning of this period, the end of the verses was marked by a sof, pasuk, and when the accents were introduced by silak besides, whatever that means, but get an idea. The old sections were retained, though not recognized as entirely correct, and the old traditional sign for the section, the smaller spacing, the little semek in printed text, was respected. The closed sections were marked in manuscripts and prints by a semek, the more open ones by a pe in the empty space before the initial word. They're trying to preserve what may have been the original text or may not when there's some question. In addition, there were introduced the Babylonian division into sections, or parasioth in the law and habataroth in the prophets, for Sabbath public reading. As these sections generally agreed with the beginning and the end of an open or closed section, they were marked by a threefold pe or semek in the empty space before the beginning. All this stuff may be mumble jumbo to you. It is kind of to me here and there. These guys are scholars, but get the picture that they've spent no end of time doing procedures that made sure that nothing was lost. They didn't know for sure sometimes whether one version, one point or another was accurate or the reflection of what was originally written. So they kept it, and then later generations could improve upon it if necessary. Codices, but even these efforts could not entirely remove variations. Hence, before the end of this period, the learned either attempted to find out by an elaborate comparison the correct punctuation and to fix it, or marked the important variations in the pronunciation, or added a caution to each apparently strange and yet correct punctuation. The greater mass of notes which the Masoretes added to the text relate to these matters. Besides, some other Masoretic manuscripts of the Bible, which are quoted in the Masoretic notes of the codices, or in the writings of the rabbis as authoritative, such as the Codex Hilleli, the Jericho Pentateuch, and others. Two codices were especially famous as model codices of the Old Testament: the Codex of Naphtali, Moses ben David ben Naphtali, and the Codex of Asher, Aaron ben Moses ben Asher, both from the first half of the 10th century. These guys were hard workers and detailed. In parentheses, Aaron lived at Tiberias, Moses in Babylon, but the latter cannot be regarded as a representative of the Babylonian text tradition. That's just where he lived. They were once more much examined by scholars. Many of the variants are noted in the Masoretic Bible manuscripts, a list of 864, or better yet 867 variants, which refer almost exclusively to vowels and accents. And all these were minutiae little variations, really hardly made any difference in the interpretation. These have been published after Jacob ben Hayim in Bomberg's and the other rabbinic Bibles, as well as in the 6th volume of the London Polyglot, but these variants are neither correct nor complete. On the Codex of Asher finally rests the whole Masoretic text of the Occidentals of the West. Of the variant readings, comparatively few were received into it, as the older scribes had already shown extraordinary solicitude for the preservation of the text and its correct reading. Their whole lives were devoted to this, by counting its sections, verses, words, letters, and by noting where and how often and when certain words, letters, or anomalies occur in the Bible, which verse is the longest and which is the shortest, and like minutiae. The Masoretes, of course, continued this work, wrote it down, and preserved it in manuscripts. The punctuation of the text, as developed by the Masoretes, proved itself so useful and met so well an essential need of those latter times, when it soon went over into manuscripts, and, with the exception of a synagogue manuscripts, almost none were written which did not contain either the pointed text alone or the pointed besides the unpointed. The other Masoretic material was written either beside or and below the text of the biblical books on the margins, and at the close of the same, or in separate Masoretic collections. There's a whole series of articles on this. You get an idea of what devotion these people had, how God worked through them, and what kind of value and trustworthiness we have of our Bible, the Hebrew Bible. And the same goes for the Greek Bible, and we'll look at that soon. The post-Masoretic period. The chapter division. After the completion of the Masoretic textual work and the collection of the notes having reference to it, no essential change was made in the text. Consequently, this period is the time of the faithful preservation, multiplication, and circulation of the Masoretic text. They didn't just print whatever they had from whatever part of the world, and we shall have a mess. They fixed the mess through much detail and effort by quite a number of people. And now what do we have? A reliable Bible. We always had one, but you had to take the extra time to wade through all the differences. Now we have hardly anything. An essential innovation was the introduction of the now customary division into chapters, which was invented by Stephen Langton at the beginning of the 13th century and applied to the Vulgate. Isaac ben Nathan adopted it for his Hebrew concordance in 1437-38, published in 1523, on which occasion the verses of the chapters were also numbered. The chapter division was first applied to the Hebrew in the second edition of Bomberg's Bible. The numbering of verses was first adopted by the Sabioneta Pentateuch, and that of the whole Bible in Athia's edition in 1661. Now we have Old Testament manuscripts. Another feature of this period is that a sufficient number of manuscripts is preserved to give an immediate knowledge of the text. The Hebrew Bible manuscripts may be divided into two cases: the public or sacred, and the private or common. The first were synagogue rolls, and have been prepared so carefully and watched so closely that the intrusion of variants and mistakes was hardly possible. Wow. But they contain only the Pentateuch, or the Pentateuch with 5 megalith or rolls: Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther, and the Haftarah in the text of the Masoretes without their additions. These manuscripts are, for the most part, of recent origin, although antique in form. They didn't change too much, being written on leather or parchment. The private manuscripts are written on the same material and also upon paper in book form, with the Masoretic editions more or less complete. It is thus difficult, indeed impossible, to determine the date and the country of these manuscripts, but none of those now known are really very old. The oldest authentic date is 916 AD, for the codex containing the prophets with Babylonian punctuation, and 1009 AD for an entire Hebrew Bible, both of which belong to the Ferkowitz collection in the Imperial Library at St. Petersburg. That's Florida. No, that's Russia. According to the most recent investigation, the MS Orient 4445 in the British Museum, that's the number, containing Genesis and so on, may be a little older. As a rule, the oldest manuscripts are the more accurate. The number of errors that crept in, especially in private manuscripts, which were prepared without any official oversight. See, there you go. that devotion to detail, their whole lives, these scribes.